Hey everyone, welcome back. You guys know I love a good deep dive, and this one is all about the history of autism. We're digging into some fascinating material from a website called Cheap ABA.
It's a great resource.
It really is. And it's got this whole timeline about autism, like how our understanding of it has changed over time, which I thought was perfect for, well, a deep dive.
Makes sense. And, getting that historical context is so important with any topic, but especially one as complex as autism.
Totally. So we're not just talking about like the science evolving, but like societal views too, right?
Exactly. It's like,
Right.
how did we even get to thinking about autism the way we do now? What were those turning points?
Okay, so where do we even start? This cheap ABA site goes way back.
Well, we've got to start at the beginning, and that takes us to the early 1900s. This is where the term autism itself actually emerges, thanks to a psychiatrist named Eugen Bleuler.
Wait, Bloiler? That name sounds familiar for some reason.
He was doing some groundbreaking work for his time. Think about it. No fancy brain scans back then, no genetic testing.
Right, they were working with like zero of the tools we have today.
Exactly. Bleuler was relying on observation, primarily, and he started noticing these patterns in some of his patients. Social withdrawal, repetitive behaviors, difficulty with communication. He saw them as potentially connected.
So he was trying to make sense of something that wasn't well understood at all.
Exactly. It was like drawing a map of a new land while you're still exploring it. And keep in mind, just identifying these traits as potentially linked was huge.
Because before that, it was just, what? Kids being difficult.
Basically. Or written off as slow or worse. Bleuler gave a name to something that had probably existed for centuries.
Right, but without that name, without that framework, it's so much harder to even study, right?
Exactly. His work was really the foundation. But things start to get even more interesting when we move into the 1940s with researchers like Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger.
Okay, now those are names I definitely recognize when it comes to autism. Did they agree with Bleuler, or were their ideas totally different?
Both Kanner and Asperger had observations that echoed Bleuler's work to an extent. They saw the behavioral patterns, the differences in social interaction, the communication challenges.
But there's a but coming, I can tell.
But what makes their work stand out is their focus on environment and this idea of behavior modification.
Okay, hold on. Because the 1940s, wasn't that when psychology itself was really taking off as a field? Like, were they influenced by that at all?
Oh, absolutely. Kanner and Asperger were very much products of their time. Psychology was becoming this hot new field, right? And with it came all these new ideas about the mind, about the potential for change and adaptation.
So you're saying this whole behavior modification thing,
Yeah.
it was pretty cutting edge for back then.
Totally. It was the idea that maybe these weren't fixed, unchangeable traits we were seeing in autism. And that opened up this whole new realm of possibility, right? The possibility of intervention.
So instead of just labeling and categorizing, there's this emerging hope that with the right support, individuals with autism could learn and grow.
Exactly. It was a huge shift in perspective. Now, we got to acknowledge, right, that early interventions, well, let's just say they were based on pretty limited understanding back then.
And probably look a little rough around the edges compared to what we do today.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. Understanding something as complex as autism, it's been a journey of trial and error for sure.
Totally.
Yeah.
But it makes you appreciate how far we have come. Like we went from naming autism to considering the environment to behavior modification. That's huge.
Yeah.
So where do things go from there?
Well, the 1970s brought about, I think, one of the most pivotal changes in how we think about autism. The spectrum concept.
Okay, yeah. The spectrum. That's huge because before that, it was like one size fits all.
Exactly. But researchers started to realize how different autism could look from one person to the next. They were seeing all this diversity, and it just didn't make sense to lump everyone together.
Right, because you have individuals who are nonverbal, you have others who are incredibly articulate, but might struggle with social cues.
And everything in between. The spectrum concept acknowledges that, It recognizes that autism manifests differently in each individual.
Which makes so much more sense given how complex the human brain is. But this spectrum idea, it wasn't just happening in isolation, was it? Like, wasn't there a lot going on in the world at that time that might have influenced this shift?
Oh, definitely. Think about it. The 70s, you've got the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement. There's this growing awareness of diversity in all its forms, a push to recognize the unique ways individuals experience the world.
And suddenly, autism isn't this thing to be categorized and standardized, but rather understood as a spectrum of experiences.
Exactly. And you know what's fascinating? This spectrum idea, it's still evolving today.
Well, yeah, we're learning more about the brain all the time, right?
Exactly. And that's one of the most important things about science. It's always willing to adapt and change as new information emerges. What we know about autism today is vastly different from what we knew a few decades ago, even.
It's like we're constantly refining the map as we go, adding details.
Exactly. And speaking of maps, we're about to enter a whole new territory in our understanding of autism, the cheap ABA timeline. It really highlights these incredible advancements in genetics and brain imaging that start to take off.
Oh, yeah, that's where things get really interesting, don't they? It's like we're finally getting a glimpse inside the brain,
Hmm.
uncovering the mysteries of autism, one scan at a time.
It really is remarkable. Like, we're going from looking at behavior to actually peering inside the workings of the
It's
brain.
going to be a game changer, right, for how we understand and support autism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And your source, Cheap ABA, they do a good job of highlighting how this focus on the brain kind of goes hand in hand with this huge wave of advocacy that was already building.
Oh, yeah, the 80s and 90s, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's when you start seeing organizations like Autism Speaks popping up.
Exactly. And it makes sense, right? Because once you start seeing autism as a spectrum, not just one thing, it naturally leads to this question of, okay, how do we best support all these individuals?
Instead of just trying to, like, put everyone in the same box.
Exactly. And that's what that advocacy was all about. It wasn't just about recognizing that autism existed, but demanding more resources, funding for research, better ways to diagnose it early on.
And just generally more awareness
Right.
so that people actually understood what autism was beyond these old stereotypes.
Absolutely. This was a big push for social inclusion, too. Instead of shutting people with autism away, how do we help them fully participate in society?
Right, because everyone deserves that chance.
Exactly. It was about recognizing that neurodiversity has value, that different ways of thinking, different ways of experiencing the world, they bring something unique to the table.
And that brings us pretty much to where we are now, right? Still learning, of course, but with a much deeper understanding than we had even a few decades ago.
And that's the really exciting part. This whole deep dive, it just shows that our knowledge is constantly evolving. What we thought we knew about autism 100 years ago is completely different from what we understand today.
Yeah.
And who knows what the future holds?
Right. What amazing discoveries are just around the corner. Okay, that is seriously cool. And kind of mind-blowing if you think about it.
Yes.
From those early observations to actually looking at the brain itself.
Yeah.
It just makes you realize that our understanding of the human mind, especially something as complex as autism, it's a journey, not a destination.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So to everyone listening, keep asking questions, keep learning, and stay curious. Because who knows what we'll discover next. This has been awesome. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.